Timbatrapami hipeti maya. Timbatrapami hipeti maya.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the curator of public programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Today's program, Komfa and the Ritual Embrace of Shaded Heritages, is generously supported by a grant from Lilly Endowment Inc. as part of our Fowler Talk series. The Fowler is honored to be a convening place for conversations and lectures that explore the many ways art creates meaning and defines purpose for people across the globe. Today, we are joined by UCLA scholar Jeremy Jacob Peretz to celebrate Mashramani, Guyana's annual carnival, commemorating the South American nation's formal severing of ties with the British crown, and the Guyanese ritual of dance, drumming, and altar making called Komfa. The program will explore through the lens of Guyana's religious material culture, how Komfa encourages devotees in the land of six peoples to embrace marginalized aspects of their heritage and shaded facets of themselves, known in Guyana's Creolese language as jumbi, or ghosts. Jeremy Jacob Peretz is a lecturer in UCLA's Department of World Arts and Culture's Dance, where he recently earned his Ph.D. in Culture and Performance. Jeremy was the recipient of Fowler's 2016 Ralph C. Altman Award, which supported some of the research he will share today about the intersections of religious and racial politics in the Southern Caribbean. In spring 2021, Peretz will begin teaching in the Department of History and Caribbean Studies at the University of Guyana. Before we get going, a few technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click View Options at the top of your screen and then select Side-by-Side mode to ensure Jeremy's video feed doesn't cover any of his presentation. If you have any questions during this program, please submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote questions that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. All right, that's enough for me. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Anka, and everyone at the Fowler. And thank everybody for being here or for tuning in, and for this opportunity to share with you all, including your art history class on visual cultures of Afro-Americas, Professor Smith. So thank you, who I must admit was my TA actually as an undergrad at UCLA. So thanks so much for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen. Hoping everybody could see this.
Yes, it's coming.
Great, thanks so much. Yes, so I understand that the students, the art history students read some of the Price's work, Sally Price and Richard Price, on Surinamese Maroons, descendants of self-emancipated Africans in Dutch colonial Guyana, and about their visual cultures and arts practices, presented so beautifully in the Price's book that accompanied the Fowler Museum's monumental exhibition in 1980 of Maroon arts that the Price's curated, and that really endowed the Fowler with such a vast collection of incredible objects and artworks from Suriname and from French Guyana. For this talk today, I'd like to pick up some on what the students have been reading and discussing about in terms of Surinamese Maroon histories and arts and visualities, including those materialized in certain objects, or just a few objects held by the Fowler, while really focusing on sharing some from my own research in Guyana for my dissertation that like Bianca said, was so generously supported by the Fowler's Altman Award for UCLA undergrad students. So my, one second, sorry. My own doctoral research centered primarily on religious formations in Guyana, and to a much lesser extent in Suriname. Although the two countries, despite national boundaries and linguistic and other cultural divergences, are and have been very much connected over many centuries, both being former Dutch and British colonies or conglomerates of colonies that in the 1960s and 70s obtained formal independence from their European colonizers, Britain in the case of what's now Guyana, and the Netherlands for Suriname. Although they traded back and forth over the past 400 years or more as prized imperial possessions that really contributed enormous wealth to Europe through mining and sugar and other forced labor plantation-based industries. So we're going to focus on religious practices in Guyana, particularly a ritual called Komfa, and certain aspects of visual and material cultures of Komfa, while also sort of straddling the border between Guyana and Suriname by thinking about how Surinamese histories, identities, and social positionalities are understood and have been constructed by Guyanese, and particularly how Surinamese Maroons and the idea of Suriname's Maroon peoples has been mobilized by Guyanese religious practitioners in their Komfa ritual performances and their altar creations. So I'll start by saying a little about Guyana generally, but similar ideas also apply to Suriname's social context as well, historical and contemporary social context. And I'm going to begin with these lines from the late Guyanese poet, playwright, and literary scholar Michael Gilkes, who says, "Don't tell me about Guyana. I born there in 33. My great-grandfather was a black man, grandmother was a Portuguese. My grandfather was a coolie, or South Asian, a Drabok, or indigenous Guyanese, white and Chinese. They call it land of six peoples, but it's seven, unless you don't count me. We had timber, bauxite, diamond and gold. Sugar was king of the crop. The Union Jack did flying upon every flagpole, and class stay upon class so with the white man upon top." Now, firstly, I don't necessarily like repeating those terms that many people do consider demeaning, racialized and ethnicized epithets, however much they are a part of everyday, all-day Guyanese speech and social life, and in many cases are important to how many Guyanese conceive of themselves and self-identify, especially younger people. So the poet, he evokes them for a reason, and the poem evokes many things, including visual images of hierarchy, of racial hierarchy, or so-called colonial social order, and of mixed or so-called miscegenated, racialized ancestries that simultaneously trouble those seemingly easy distinctions of order, with this order and transgressions of evasions of colonial discourse. The poem also evokes images of extraction, timber, bauxite, diamond, and gold, king, sugar, colonial extraction, and coerced labor, explicitly based in white supremacy and European imperial domination. And so while the poet says, "Don't tell me about Guyana," most non-Guyanese need a little more background. So these are small nations population-wise, former British Guyana, Dutch Guyana, and Suriname, and French Guyana, which still remains an overseas territory of France. So not necessarily many people relatively, with some of the largest tracts of pristine Amazon rainforest left, situated north of Brazil and southeast of Venezuela. So that's where Guyana is, but what about, they call it land of six peoples, that Kilks mentioned and that Bianca started us with too, which is really the popular nationalistic slogan for the nation's pluralist multiculturality, an ideology which that reality of the last line in the poem, the white man upon top, really disrupts, even with very few people in Guyana or Suriname who identify as white, remaining since independence, when most, or those that were there, most left. So Guyana's last national census, for instance, recorded only about 400 Guyanese self-identifying as white of a population of around 750,000. And so now indigenous Guyanese make up only about 10% of that population, while in both Guyana and Suriname, the majority, or the plurality of people at least, comprise people of Asian descent, followed closely by people of African heritage, according to demographic data, the most current. So while situated on the South American mainland, these countries are generally considered culturally part of the Caribbean, with CARICOM, the Caribbean Community of Nations, headquartered just outside of Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. And so the Guyanese social landscape today, not to mention the physical landscape, as with much of contemporary life globally, is a direct product of colonization and of enslavement, an afterlife of slavery, whereby in wake of emancipation, former slave owners lobbied British and later Dutch colonizers to secure renewed sources of bound labor, undermining the newly free people's promised wages, by importing in mass people coerced into indenture in colonies across the world, really, from China and India and Indonesia and Madeira, Portugal. While at the same time, many Afro-Guyanese purchased so-called failing plantation estates, creating their own cooperative villages directly after slavery. And Maroons in Suriname had already secured their own politically independent sovereign communities at a remove from the deprivations of the coastal plantation economies, with treaties acknowledged with the Dutch as early as the 1760s, which was a century or more before formal emancipation. Now, this conception of a land of six peoples is salient within everyday social life in Guyana, and most people do identify themselves with one of these six Guyanese ancestries. People who identify with more than one are generally considered, and often not so nicely, as Dougla, a Creolese word for mixed, Creolese being the main language of Guyana. Reflecting on her own upbringing in Georgetown within a family, quote, which looked Afro-Guyanese, the scholar Shona Jackson writes in the preface to her book, Creole Indigeneity, Between Myth and Nation in the Caribbean, that, quote, while many Guyanese admit they are mixed, we figuratively close the shades on other parts of our blood, ignoring the meeting of worlds within us in order to assert our identities as historical continuity and not as limbo, end quote. And while nearly 40% of Guyanese do self-identify as African or Black, as the census delineates, still systemic, institutionalized, and implicit, customary, pervasive anti-Blackness persists, particularly as global white supremacy doesn't demand the presence of white bodies to enact racist policies and practices, which of course come in their own multitudinous localized forms. religious life in Guyana and Suriname is particularly burdened by these legacies of European colonization and genocide, and anti-Black ideologies are overwhelmingly attached to what in Guyana gets considered African religion, sometimes disparaged or embraced as obia or as Komfa. So just to take as one brief and highly disturbing example of this public post that circulated widely on Facebook last year, while Guyanese were enduring a terribly protracted election crisis. So the logic of the post demonstrates how ideologies constructing ethno-racial identities continue to be informed by conceptions of religion, with, quote, divine figureheads juxtaposed to quote, voodoo worshiping in ways that underwrite a credibility of racial religious personhood, or purported lack of personhood. So without conforming to colonial Christian or world religion, i.e. Hindu or Muslim exemplars, those comprising the so-called Black race, for this Facebook user at least, and many followers, are deemed utter non-persons through a form of racial religious negation. And revealingly, indigenous people are altogether absent from the whole schematic of religious racism. So for many Guyanese, like people elsewhere, including most all US contexts, interpreting, trying to understand and rationalize and determine and people's so-called race, including one's own, is an ever-present social predicament. And it's important that interpretive acts are often visual ones, or at least preemptively or preliminarily based in visual signs or cues or clues. And yet, while constructions of race might start with the visual, performance or presentation and interpretation of race certainly don't end with the gaze, but move beyond seeing towards both lethal and sometimes liberatory ends. So I want to think a bit about this visuality of race, and particularly racial interpolation, assigning race, in part because the process's significance within Guyanese Komfa, a ritual practice that's central to the lives of people who generally refer to themselves as spiritualists or faithists, and who comprise communities or spiritual families, typically called spiritual churches. So most spiritualists are women, including many trans and queer women, and it's predominantly practiced among Afro-Guyanese and considered an Africa-derived tradition, although the ritual incorporates cultural inheritances from all Guyanese, as practitioners say, and as we'll see just now. So Komfa, practitioners explain, is essentially about offering thanks through entertaining the ancestors in what are typically elaborate works or services dedicated to one or more of the nations of the dead who are attracted to the feast by song and drumming and by lavish all created in their home, which is danced around, and the items on which are utilized and distributed and consumed in what's generally an all-night communal occasion of both introspection and revelry. Reflecting and refracting colonial Guyana's social orders and post-colonial nationalist ambitions, most spiritualists conceive of humanity as comprising 7 distinct nations of living and dead, representatives of which manifest in Komfa ritual to offer what guidance, consolation, and healing blessings they can to those who continue to remember them, entertain them, and become them, which is what Komfa really means, usually and reductively translated as spirit possession. As practitioners say, the aim of the ritual is ultimately to help one learn about oneself and become oneself or multiple selves, usually through first learning about and continually becoming one's predecessors, one's guiding ancestor spirits. So cultivating and nurturing ongoing relationships with one's past but not gone ancestors is a fundamental aspect of Komfa. And knowing one's ancestors often starts with knowing them as ethno-racialized personas that conform to and index popular social stereotypes of Guyana's so-called 6 races or peoples. As practitioners learn about the life experiences of their guiding spirits and those of their spiritual family members, they tend to move beyond those initial caricature-like impressions or archetypal life stories and develop deep intersubjective identifications with their divinized dead relatives, which they're not always often revealed to be at first or even at all. Spirit guides aren't always necessarily direct kin relations of mediums. So one initial question that emerges is, how does one gender and racially profile a revenant, one who manifests within the body of living mediums during ritual? Through the basis of performance and transportality in embodying the dead, Komfa tends to inherently trouble this ocular centrism or visuality of both gender and racial ascriptions. Mediums manifest ancestors of all 7 nations, they say, or of all backgrounds and gender presentations, regardless of how a medium may otherwise identify themselves or be identified by others in different social contexts. So much scholarship in critical race and feminist theory considered the implications of the visuality of both race and gender as ocular-centric constructs, typically read through visual cues. Race and gender are seen first and foremost, which profiling is most understood to work. Police or whoever it is in that split second of actualizing what are usually considered unconscious or implicit biases draw their gun in the first place because they see a Black body, not a white one. In that instant, race or racial designation, or what before I called interpolation or over-determining through the gaze, following Frantz Fanon, is made unequivocally visual. That's what the unrelenting reels of body cam footage show. In terms of gender, particularly for trans women, but also other non-conforming individuals, it might be the duplicity of the observer's gaze that triggers the fatal or otherwise violent act when a cop or John or whoever realizes in that second that who they thought they saw is somehow not who they saw. They thought they first fixed and overdetermined somehow deceived them and their categories. And so this overdetermining of the gaze, reducing someone to the visual, coupled with the utter devaluation of Black life and of trans lives, has devastating ramifications when one considers this past year in 2020 recorded the highest number ever of murders of trans and otherwise gender non-conforming people in the US, with the overwhelming majority of those killed being Black women. So for just 1 second before getting deeper into the Komfa work and the maroon connections, I just want to add that there's this important interplay and dialogue or gap between the performed stereotype or galaxy of stereotypes, as Fanon says, and that obstinate image between the ideologies informing racecraft and gender construction and that moment of attributing race and gender to bodies, let alone individuals. And this interplay between the deeply realized relationships that spiritualists and their guides eventually come to foster with one another, living and dead, and the caricature-like personas of spirits or jumbi, ghosts, and shaded selves that mediums often first encounter. So there exists, according to Michael Omi and Howard Winott, a quote, never-ending tension embedded in what we call racial formation between the social construction of race and the corporeality of race. And it's in Black Skin, White Masks, however, that Fanon writes, quote, I'm given no chance. I am overdetermined from without. I am the slave, not of the idea that others have of me, but of my own appearance. I am fixed by the other's gaze. Now, to shift directions just slightly, you may have noticed I said that Guyanese say, and that the poem says, that Guyana is the land of peoples, that spiritualists recognize and manifest 7 nations of ethno-racialized, gendered spirits, or jumbi. So what's with the 6 peoples and 7 nations? You might wonder, with people and nation synonymous, here at least, along with so-called races. It's something that your professor has pushed me on before, talking to the students there. And it relates to both the idea and the purported appearances of the Dutch nation specifically, and more generally to the divergences in the representation of whiteness and Europeanness in Guyana's past and contemporary society. So to return real quick to the Mashramani float, and happy Mashramani, everybody. This float sponsored by the Guyanese government, which shows the 6 peoples of the land. And you see that for Guyanese, Portuguese who came to Guyana as indentured laborers are not understood as European or white, or not in the same sense as their Anglo colonizing counterparts. Now, for most spiritualists, Portuguese are not a distinct nation and are understood as whites, while spiritualists also conceive of a Spanish nation, which Guyanese generally don't recognize as their own category, their own one of the 6 distinct peoples of the land. What's most important for the remainder of the talk here is that spiritualists also recognize the Dutch nation as one of their 7 ancestral categories, which again, Guyanese don't generally distinguish from other Europeans or whites, or otherwise mark as their own category, like they do Portuguese. So Komfa ritual cosmologies have constructed a place for Dutch ancestries that's somehow incongruent with general Guyanese racial ideologies. The divergence and its actionable efficacies are made most explicit when practitioners speak of their Dutch spirits, or really when the Dutch jumbi speak for themselves. Dutch spirits are often described as juga, which is a somewhat pejorative term that many scholars, including the Prices, use, and that Guyanese use to refer to all Maroons in Suriname. The term more specifically refers to Okanasi people, who are one of the 6 major Maroon groups in Suriname and French Guyana. So in other words, spiritualists' Dutch nation of ancestors is overwhelmingly a Black nation, with some white Dutch ghosts occasionally manifesting. Primarily, they identify themselves as people who were either formerly enslaved by Dutch planters prior to British rule, or alternatively as Maroons who had fled persecution on Dutch-owned estates. Regardless, it's very common for Dutch spirits to be referred to as Maroons, descendants of Maroons, who are primarily associated with Suriname and Berbice, what's today the easternmost county of Guyana on the border with Suriname, and was formerly a separate longtime Dutch colony where Maroon communities were present into the early 1800s. Unlike in Suriname, the Berbetian Guyanese Maroon communities don't necessarily persist today. Many were killed through genocide and or otherwise displaced by Dutch and later English soldiers and mercenaries, including by enslaved and coerced Africans and indigenous Guyanese who were paid, or whose so-called masters were paid by the colonial government to pursue and destroy Maroon settlements, Maroon communities in what's today Suriname and Guyana, murdering and abducting Maroons in attempts to dissuade other enslaved people from seeking refuge and self-emancipation. And those are some of the stories and the histories and life stories that Dutch spirits recount with their mediums and their spiritual families. Now, Blackness and what's understood as African culture in Guyana and Suriname are both overwhelmingly devalued through the lingering legacies of plantation ideologies and through the related contemporary flows of global white supremacy. In many ways, in a sort of anthropological Herskowitzian thinking that I think the students read some about in the prices, I think, Guyanese and non-Maroon Surinamese understand Maroons as supposedly more African culturally and genealogically, closer to Africa and African forebears than are their Afro-Guyanese or Afro-Surinamese counterparts, the latter who refer to themselves as Creoles in part to distinguish themselves from Afro-Surinamese Maroons. Guyanese in particular often have much to say about Jupa or Maroons in terms of their apparent blackness, their visual blackness, and often emphasize in Creolese that Maroons are black, meaning one can see their blackness. Along with such thinking are highly popular and perpetually deployed stereotypes associating Maroons with Obia, or Caribbean so-called black magic, by non-practitioners. The quote from a recent scholarly article analyzing so-called money-making demons, or Baku, and racial stereotypes in Guyana and Suriname, the authors say that, quote, Obia seems to dominate how Guyanese imagine Surinamese Maroons, end quote. Such social constructions have had detrimental effects on Maroon people and communities up through to the present moment. But these imaginings also offer alternative horizons, which Guyana's spiritualists have embraced. For related reasons as Maroons, Komfa and its practitioners have also been particularly marginalized in Guyanese society, in part through the tradition's real and imagined relationships to Africa, to Africanness, or Afro-Guyaneseness. Spiritualists, regardless of their own heritage, tend to have an inverse appreciation of Komfa's associations to Blackness and purported origins in West and Central Africa. And many intently center their devotional approaches around their guides and deities who identify with Africa, their African nation of the 7 nations. Now, just real quickly, ancestors from all 7 nations are entertained in Komfa services, and most churches or gatherings have shrines dedicated to all 7 nations that serve as permanent fixtures, fostering reciprocal interaction with the ancestors. Altars dedicated to one or more nations of spirits are also constructed anew as a primary local for each soul work, usually on a table inside or on the ground outside for what's called an earthwork or groundwork or digdoti. And some churches are devoted more particularly to certain nations or ancestors, such as some who intentionally foreground their indigenous Amerindian ancestors, or those that incorporate generously from other adjacent or contiguous Guyanese traditions or idioms, like Kali Mai Puja, a South Asia-derived practice that's not necessarily appreciated by Guyanese Hindu orthodoxies. And so all nations have their place, their roles, their expertise, and different ways to be valued and honored and appreciated and entertained through spiritual work. And ultimately to give back to their living host family members. And there's a whole range of devotional approaches, some like this Kali Mai Mandir community, who tend to consider themselves devotees of Mother Kali, but many of whom nonetheless also see themselves as doing Komfa, as they say. Like with other nations, practitioners' interactions with spirits from the Indian nation help them to reapproach and often revalue shaded aspects of themselves, to use Shona Jackson's words quoted before, or to uncover and begin to piece together what Guyanese novelist and theorist Wilson Harris has called fossil identities. And so altar making and the visual and material aspects of Komfa are a major part of the ritual, or embodying the ritual of embodying the ancestors, especially altars and the sacrificial items therein that are assembled for services, sometimes to great expense. So the things being used by spirits and others gathered as part of the spiritual work. In performing the different ancestors, manifesting them, becoming them, mediums and other attendees can and often do move past static notions of ethno-racial and gendered and sexualized conceptions of self, beyond ideas fixed through appearances to embody multiplicities of selves, revealing the many jumbis that make up who they are, or more directly, I think, and practitioners say, the jumbis themselves revealing to us the many repressed aspects of who we might be or be ever becoming. Now, the role of Dutch or Juka Maroon ancestors is vital in many forms of spiritual work and healing rites. Dutch and Juka ancestors who manifest are highly respected as Africans, and they often help perform roles related in direct or indirect ways to revaluations of stigmatized African and Afro-Guyanese culture, including religious culture and African ancestries, identities, and subjectivities. And while there is this distinction made between African and Dutch nations, in practice, it's less salient, the distinction. And many ritual works and altars are said to be dedicated to either or both African and Dutch or Juka ancestors. People do say, however, that spirits from the African nation are somewhat less approachable than Dutch, who are considered more relatable and proximate, more engageable, and most all more responsive than their spirit counterparts identified specifically as African and not as Dutch or Juka. Dutch spirits typically wear pangi, or large colorful madras cloth, as do practitioners, often for works dedicated to both African and Dutch nations. Pangi are Maroon people's most common traditional clothing item, although unlike Surinamese Maroons, Guyanese don't usually alter the trade cloth in any meaningful ways. The Fowler Museum, for example, has in its collection a massive array of pangi made by Maroon peoples in intricate styles and patterns and colors going back over a century. So anyway, in Guyana, spiritualists use pangi and other items associated with Maroons in manifesting their Dutch ancestral guides. Also typical of Dutch and African works is the use of calabash bowls, which Surinamese maroon artists are renowned for carving, in which the Fowler again has an incredible collection. Most calabash bowls that spiritualists use in ritual aren't carved. They often have a few specially made ones, usually imported from Suriname, that serve as important central vessels for Dutch works specifically. Here's an example from the Fowler's collection that's included in the Price's book, this images. Drums, an essential element of devotion, are also items that are commonly brought back from Suriname for spiritual purposes, although Komfa drums are also still made locally in Guyana, but just with less regularity than in the past. This image shows what was described to me as a traditional Komfa drum, complete with komudi, or anaconda skin, wrapped around the barrel. While this one is an apinti drum made by a maroon sculptor in Suriname and held by the Fowler. So, and I'm getting there. Spiritualist churches and sometimes homes of practitioners are marked by flags and guarded by calabash trees, considered as spiritual fences to ward off unwanted and potentially harmful visitors, spirits, and living people. In Suriname, maroon villages and sacred sites are generally protected with dried palm fences that serve analogous functions. And living calabash trees are also considered sacred or efficacious by Suriname's maroons and by spiritualists in Guyana. And all nations of the spirits are known through banners and colored flags, as is also happens to be a practice among Guyanese Hindus, as well as maroons in Suriname, whose ancestral shrines are often marked by both low, colorful flags and lofty, white, flowing banners. In this image from Suriname, you see the same palm frond protective fence around the communal ancestral shrine of Ditabiki village, and this towering ancestor cloth, as well as the special croton plants growing that are also typically used in Guyana's spiritualists' altars dedicated to both African and Dutch or Juka nations that you might have seen in some of the images that were shown in the images of the altars before, that croton plan. Guyanese spiritualist churches tend to have either 7 flags, each for a different color, each a different color for each of the 7 nations, or a single banner with 7 colored bands, usually held aloft on towering bamboo poles. And people don't generally pay the flags marking spiritualist churches too much mind, as many homes in Guyana have colored jumbi flags that Hindus display for ritual purposes. So the spiritualist churches are somewhat discreet, which is always a consideration given the discrimination that practitioners face and their largely marginalized social status. So for non-practitioners, all these things, jumbi flags, calabash, pangi, or other maroon or African print fabric clothing, and especially drums, are all considered implements of obia and associated in most Guyanese people's minds with forms of social malevolence or bad work, and through related logic, considered as maroon or Juka materialities. So such associations do not necessarily deter Guyana's spiritualists, who are known to go through great lengths, monetarily and otherwise, in traveling to Suriname to engage in spiritual work, often specifically Dutch work, collaborating with and employing the services of Surinamese ritual specialists or Winti practitioners. Winti being an idiom to Komfa subscribed to primarily by both Afro-Surinamese Creoles and Maroons, though in differing ways. What Guyanese spiritualists often consider the most powerful, efficacious, and meaningful works are performed only in Suriname, and the accompaniment, with the accompaniment of Maroons. And while participating regularly in such pilgrimage is beyond the means of a great many spiritualists. The various objects and stories, rituals, and the spirits that they and their gatherings bring back from Suriname often serve extra special heightened functions in their realizing ongoing relationships with their Dutch and other dead. And so in realizing their multiple unfixed and ongoing selves in the making. Okay, so Komfa's jumbi-scapes then are not only the physical pathways that spiritualists and their spirits traverse, but also the connections made, the relationships cultivated between living people and between living people and their dead counterparts who return in ritual. Jumbi-scapes are also the special connections made and maintained between special places, imagined and real, racialized and considered ancestral, close by in Guyana and far off to Suriname, to Africa, to Asia, and Europe as well, everywhere from where spirits and living Guyanese have come, and to where they visit their mediums who manifest the dead and enliven them again through their bodies, through their altar creations, their songs and dances, and through their other offerings of food and drink and perfume and flowers and candles and much more. So just to finish real fast, so while Komfa people do tend to uphold in many ways many of these normative, historically embedded misconceptions and misrepresentations of Maroons that most all Guyanese learn to replicate, such as that Maroons are, for whatever reason, or using different sorts of reasoning, somehow more Black and closer to Africa than other Surinamese or Guyanese. Still, at the same time, Komfa cosmologies and ritual formations have also provided means for reimagining, revaluing, and reclaiming that Maroon Blackness as respected and as esteemed aspects of themselves and their own multiple cultural and ancestral heritages, their own 7 nations dancing inside, as practitioners say, who as spirits, as like all, or like other shaded or fossilized identities might be difficult to discern visually, but who can be otherwise sensed and deeply known. And so people draw help from Komfa's special ways of sensing and knowing and making the world and themselves in it. And just to close, I'd like to quote from Haitian novelist Edwidge Danica, who in her preface to the Fowler's book that accompanied the 2012 exhibition In Extremis, Death and Life in 21st Century Haitian Art, write of this complexity and indeterminacy involved in discerning the import of signs that Haitian ancestors and spirits provide their devotees. Quote, even the public utterances that possession allows, Dandicott writes, often feel like the tip of the iceberg, or better yet, the lava that spews out of a volcano after years of boiling beneath the surface. As with living people, spirits are even more difficult to know through surface readings, through profiling, which is why Donikat says, quote, "We seek the kind of dead who speak, the ones who still remember language, the ones who still know words. The rest we are to know in fragments." Thank you. And I hope that people might have questions. I would love that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you so much for sharing all of that awesome fieldwork from Guyana with such great visual documentation. Really helped illustrate everything that you were saying so well, and really appreciate you sharing so much with us today. We have a couple questions here. First of all, is a copy of that poem that you read in the beginning of the program, is that available anywhere for folks who would like to see a copy of it?
Yes, it is published in a number of compilations, like Caribbean poetry compilations. The one I found it in is called Voice Print. I could put the info in the chat if that would help.
You can also put it in the Q&A portal as a response to his question.
Oh,
but
yes.
The chat works as well. And someone else was wondering if you could remind us of the title of Price's book that you mentioned.
Yes, I even have it. I could show the cover.
Perfect.
Called, what's it? This is Afro-American Rainforest. And this is one that was, that accompanied the Fowler's exhibition in 1980. There's other Price books as well, but I recommend the Fowler one.
Thanks for the plug. Thank you very much. Okay, great. And then were you able to get the information about the poem in either the chat or the Q&A for Tur Johnson, who asked? Someone is asking if you can speak more about the idea of, or the idiom of nation in Komfa. This is from Catherine. So much overlap. Oh, it's moving around. So much overlap between flags and ethnicities in Komfa and Mashramani. Also, is Mashramani sacred in Komfa?
That's a great question. You know, there is some overlap in that there's usually, Mashramani is usually recognized, or at least by some spiritualist groups that I've worked with through, in the form of like offering libations, which is a common sort of more public-facing practice that spiritualists are often called to perform by different community members. So, for instance, a village might organize, and most do, except for this year, unfortunately, with the pandemic and all. Most communities organize their own parades or sort of somewhat masquerades for Mashramani. That's the carnival part in some ways. And so often that begins with Komfa people being asked to work as an in-between between the group doing the performing and the ancestors, the spirits, to overlook the Mashramani festivities. Looking at.
There's also a question about. Are you ready to move on to the next one?
Sure. Yeah, I was just gonna. Yeah. No. Go ahead.
Okay. Someone's wondering if you can talk more about fossilized identities, which you mentioned. It's a new phrase to this person. They're wondering if you can tell us more about it.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting concept or way that Wilson Harris has talked about. He's talking specifically about Guyanese identities, but he also related to other, mostly to post-colonial peoples or formerly colonized peoples. As a way of thinking about this what Wilson Harris calls cross-culturality. So these differences in backgrounds and histories that meet in individuals, and it connects in a lot of ways to those quotes from that Shona Jackson way of describing the way that that due to these layers of traumatic experience, that it's often hard for people to embrace more than those kind of singular ideas of self.
Got it. That's super interesting. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. We've got 2 more minutes left. We've got someone asking about what it's like to be in the field as a researcher. How do you get such access into these communities? And do you have like a liaison or someone who's kind of guiding you through and helping you make these connections? How does that work?
Well, for the most part, the spiritualist communities that I've worked with have been extremely welcoming, and I guess in a lot of ways appreciate the kind of interest that I've shown in their own traditions and their practices, especially considering that many Guyanese themselves are not as interested, and maybe interested is not necessarily the way, the best way to describe it, but there definitely is this stigmatization, there's a generational difference too. Most spiritualists, at least most that I have worked with, do tend to be older people. I mean, it really was not such an issue in terms of being able to find and interact with members of the spiritualist churches. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your access with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us. This program has been recorded for you to refer to should you need it for pleasure or studying. And it will be on our website. We'll send you the link when it's available for you to look back on and share as you see fit. We hope you'll join us again for our next program. You can find details on the closing slide. Thanks again, Jeremy, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you everybody for being here and for your interest in Komfa.